Good. Hi everybody, my name is William Thomas. I'm part of the kinesiology faculty here at Cal State Fullerton. I teach exercise physiology, both lecture and lab components here. I'm also the reigning 2019, obviously there was no 2020, California State Time Trial Champion. So today we're going to be talking about the whys of training. For most of you guys that are... My name is William Thomas. Uh-oh. I'm part of the kinesiology I'm sorry, hold on one second. Cal State Fullerton. Many of you have coaches and probably are prescribed some training that you kind of know, okay, this is for VO2 max, this is for your FTP, so on and so forth, but you may not necessarily understand why it works. And in my honest opinion, I think a lot of coaches don't know exactly why it works. They just know, okay, these are a set of VO2 max training sessions, these are a set of threshold training sessions, so on and so forth, and they prescribe it. But unless you know the whys of what's going on, you can't really custom tailor it to your specific physiology. So today I'm going to talk about that and some of the tricks that I use as a coach to maximize performance. So first of all, we're going to talk about aerobic power and FTP. Why aerobic power and why aren't we going to concentrate on anaerobic power? Because anaerobic power really is, because cycling is an aerobic sport, anaerobic power depends on aerobic power. And I'll give you an example. If you race the 100-meter dash and that lasts, if you're really fast, about 10 seconds, that is purely anaerobic. However, if somebody required you to do the 100-meter dash, let's say every minute, then it would quickly become an aerobic sport. That is because the recovery from anaerobic performances, such as sprinting, is aerobic. This is why all these sports that are predominantly anaerobic, like football, like basketball, require aerobic conditioning. So your ability to repeat sprints, so on and so forth, requires a good aerobic system. Otherwise, you're going to have to sit with your team in the draft and hope that your anaerobic system isn't compromised by a lack of fitness. So aerobic is always base for performance. So let's talk about this. Before we even get to talking about the specifics of training and what happens with regards to the training effect on your body, we must talk about the three principles of training. That is overload, specificity, and reversibility. Now I have a star right here on specificity because that's what we're going to concentrate on today, but let me run through these really quickly so you understand. When you train, you must overload your body. In other words, if the stimulus that you present is something that you're used to, you're not overloading yourself, and you should expect yourself to quickly plateau and make no further gains. So training sessions must be overload. They must be progressive in manner. Specificity means that if you want to be a better cyclist, you should ride your bike. If you want to be a better runner, you should run. And so training, the adaptations to specific exercises, specific sports, are specific in nature. However, there is some crossover effect. For example, if you wanted to be a really good cyclist and you took on a running program, there are some crossover effects, but ultimately, if you want to be a better cyclist, for example, a time trial athlete, you better do practice time trialing. Third, and not only the specific sport itself, but also the intensity. So if you want to be a good TT artist, then you're going to have to ride at your TT pace. You're going to have to practice that. And generally, the closer and closer you get to an event, the more specific you want to become. So for example, early in the off season, when you transition from your rest, you might want to start doing cross training to kind of bring up your cardiovascular system, but not get into that specific type of training that can cause mental fatigue. If we were going to train 12 months out of the year doing the same sport, we might get burned out mentally. But as we get closer and closer to the race day, you better be very specific in not only the type of training, but also the intensity of training. Reversibility simply means it's a use it or lose it phenomenon, and that if you stop training, your body will quickly regress to its its normal state, and that is being lack of fitness. So you have to continually train to make progress. If you don't at least aren't in a maintenance mode, you will regress and lose it. So let's get into specificity. So when we're talking about aerobic power and ATP, we got to talk about aerobic power training. Now, when I say aerobic, many of you are probably familiar with VO2 max, and that is your body's maximal ability to uptake oxygen and consume oxygen. So in order to maximize your aerobic power, you want to raise this value. You want to increase your body's ability to use oxygen. Now, there are 3 ways you can go about doing that. The determinants of aerobic power are your pulmonary system, your circulatory system, and your tissues, and more specific, your muscles, because during exercise, the tissues that consume most of the oxygen are your skeletal muscles, the ones that are active. So, of course, all tissues, your brain, your heart, your kidneys, non-vital organs, they all consume oxygen all the time, but during exercise, your skeletal muscles that are engaged in that activity consume the most. So if we're going to improve aerobic power, and these are the determinants, your pulmonary system, your circulatory system, and your muscles, which one do we improve? All of them? Do we train all of them? Or do one or the other have a bigger effect on your VO2 max? The answer is that your pulmonary system has a very small effect. So any kind of pulmonary training that you do has a very small effect on improving your VO2 max. And that's because your lungs are pretty well set in their size. Where you do get some kind of pulmonary training is from the muscles that drive ventilation. For example, your diaphragm. Those do adapt. But in general, our lungs are overbuilt for your VO2 max. So we want to settle in really on circulatory or your cardiovascular system and your muscular system in terms of maximizing your VO2 max. Both of those have a large effect. Now the difference is your circulatory system adapts really quickly. So some of those first gains that you see from training your VO2 max are primarily from gains in your circulatory system. What happens is that your heart starts to pump with more force, but also, and then the main part is your blood volume increases. So your blood volume increases, and what happens is your heart, which is, you can think of it as a muscular balloon, fills up to a greater extent, and with each beat, it pumps out more blood. If it pumps out more blood, your muscles have more access to more oxygen. So one of the first adaptations that comes from doing aerobic exercise is an increase in blood volume and an increase in what's called cardiac stroke volume, more blood, more oxygen per heartbeat. All right, this is why when your resting heart rate, this is why athletes' resting heart rate typically drops from around 70 beats per minute to might even get into the 30s, because their heart is pushing out more blood per beat, more nutrients, and your heart does not have to work as hard because it's pushing out more blood. Next, your muscles. Now this also has a large effect, but it's more long-term. So the adaptations that you see on the muscular level are more long-term. One of the largest things in terms of increasing your aerobic power that happens is that your muscles will increase mitochondrial density. And so aerobic consumption or oxygen consumption, aerobic power production, comes from your mitochondria in your muscles. So more mitochondria in your muscles, more aerobic power you can produce. So you might think, well, how do I increase the amount of mitochondria in my muscles during exercise? Well, let's talk about that. Many of you may have heard of this. ATP. ATP is what our muscles, all cells in our body get our energy from to do work. So in order to contract your muscles, your body has to produce ATP. Now, when you start exercising, or let me start off with this. When you're at rest, your body has lots of ATP stored. The demands aren't high. But when you go from rest to exercise transition, immediately your ATP levels start to get used up and your ATP levels drop. This, your body senses this as a threat to energy homeostasis. In other words, a low energy environment. ATP levels drop, and something that is called ADP plus PI or phosphate levels rise. So basically we break down ATP, we release the energy in that third bond by hydrolyzing ATP, and what we're left over is ADP and inorganic phosphate. Well, this low energy environment activates an enzyme that is called AMPK. When AMPK levels rise within your muscles, they stimulate the production of more mitochondria. So the whole goal is to increase AMPK levels with these training sessions. Now, there's a problem. It's not so simple. The problem is that to sustain low levels of AMPK, especially during high intensity exercise, you have to increase what all of you guys know, what happens with high intensity exercise, increase this, lactic acid, right? So high intensity exercise drives down ATP levels, drives up AMPK, which is a potent stimulus for more mitochondria, but the consequence is more lactic acid is produced, and we know that lactic acid is responsible for premature fatigue. So, and we're familiar, I know you guys are familiar with lactic acid, but more specifically what it is this. Lactic acid quickly dissociates into this lactate, and you guys have heard of that, lactate threshold, and hydrogen ions. Lactate is actually good. It's actually a fuel that our bodies can use to make more energy. We can even make glucose from lactate, our liver can, but this really is the part of lactic acid that promotes fatigue. This is what causes your muscles to burn. So how do we keep our AMPK levels high, but minimize the accumulation of this? Because when this accumulates within your muscles, it promotes fatigue, and then you can't train with quality anymore, right? So for example, you might push it too far on an interval, too long. This accumulates, causes fatigue in those motor units, and therefore your whole session goes to waste because you can no longer do any more intervals because of this associated fatigue. So how do we keep this at bay while keeping AMPK levels high to promote mitochondrial genesis? Simple. And this is really, you can feel this. We don't have to check your blood or anything like that. I tell my athletes to not dig deep when they're doing their intervals in the preparatory stage. So digging deep has its time and place, but generally when you're digging deep, what's happening is you have increased anaerobic metabolism and increased hydrogen ion accumulation. So this promotes fatigue. When you dig deep, you're going more anaerobic, you're making more hydrogen ions and promoting accelerating fatigue. So grinding out those last intervals really should be left for just before the weeks prior to an event. And in many cases, I don't want to say don't ever do this, because this is important for mental preparation for races. Digging deep, learning how to suffer, so to speak. But in terms of the muscular adaptations, not the mental expectation, in terms of the muscular adaptations, you can get more out of not digging deep because you can control this. And by controlling this, you can do more volume at X power level. So, how do I do this? I try to keep the intervals at high intensity. So first of all, I want to talk about, and this is very important, and this is something that a lot of people do not understand, coaches, athletes, is something that's called, and we're going to talk about the muscular adaptations first. So, muscles. I know most of you have heard of slow twitch muscle fibers, fast twitch muscle fibers, type 1 muscle fibers, type 2 muscle fibers. Why they are important is because when you start, let's say you're going to do you're going to go out and you're going to ride really easy. For example, 40% VO2 max. If you're going to, and this is 40% VO2 max is probably around 55% FTP, something like that for reference. If you were to go out and ride at that level, you are only going to be recruiting type 1 muscle fibers. Now, in other words, up to here they plateau off, they're maximally recruited at 40%. Type 2As go up to here, 75% VO2 max, plateau off, and the remaining 100% VO2 max and above are taken up by type 2X fibers. Basically what we go is we do this, then we add in this, so type 1 plus type 2As, then we add in this. So at 100% VO2 max, we're 1s plus 2As plus 2Xs. This is the take-home point. If you exercise at a low intensity like this, you are only recruiting type 1 muscle fibers. These muscle fibers, the type 2s, are not getting trained. So you should not expect any kind of a muscular adaptation that comes from low intensity exercise training. Now, can you burn fat? Yes. So you can perhaps improve your watts per kilo by lowering your kilograms, but you're not going to get a muscular benefit in the type 2 muscle fibers by training low intensity. Now, circulatory system and muscular system are very important to VO2 max. So, another graph for you. With regards to exercise intensity, your circulatory system gets this kind of a workout until you get to your VO2 max. So, is your circulatory system benefiting, let's say this is 40% VO2 max. This is 75%. And this is obviously 100%. Is your circulatory system getting a benefit at 40% VO2 max? Absolutely. Is your type 2s getting a benefit? They are not. So what if we push it up to 75? Our circulatory system gets, so this is cardiac output. Our circulatory system at 75% gets a bigger training effect. And then we also are training our type 1s and type 2As at 75%. Well, what if we go higher? What if we go up to 100%? Even more of a workout for our circulatory system, even more of a workout for our muscle fibers. Now, so why don't we just always train at 100% VO2 max? And so we can train all of those muscle fibers, and we can train our circulatory system to the max, no pun intended. And that is because we cannot spend a lot of time at 100% VO2 max, right? So if you were to go out and do a 100% VO2 max effort, you would last between 3 and 8 minutes, and that would be it. So in order to manipulate that time, what do? We break that up into intervals so we can spend more time at VO2 max. So for example, we might do 4 3-minute interval sessions at 100% VO2 max. The total time spent there would be 12 minutes. So you would spend a larger duration by doing an interval type workout 100% versus just doing a singular effort. This is really the main reason behind doing intervals, is the ability to accumulate more time at a high intensity by breaking it up. Now, the way I like to do it is I like to shorten the recovery intervals, but also shorten the time spent at a particular power level. So let's say that you could spend 6 minutes max at doing one set at 100% VO2 max. I might do 3 minutes, and I know that at that point, after 3 minutes, there won't be a lot of this that is accumulated. I can take a really quick break and go back down to 40%, because one of the things about going down to 40% VO2 max is you can start to burn some of these up. So in other words, reduce the hydrogen ion accumulation from your muscles, get them back down to where you can do another set, and then they're going to build up again, right? So we can control, by putting in these breaks, or these recovery breaks, we can control hydrogen ion accumulation. So the benefit of low intensity is we can start to get rid of this, which promotes fatigue. So what I like to do is, number one, do not dig deep, especially in the early stages of training, doing intervals. Number two, shorten the exercise duration intervals a little bit to make sure that you're not digging deep. Number three, intersperse short recovery breaks. For example, they could be 30 seconds, they could be 1 minute in between these sessions to control hydrogen ion production. If you do that, you might be able to spend, instead of, let's say, 12 minutes at VO2 max, you might be able to spend 20 minutes at VO2 max. In other words, you're getting a bigger duration, more amount of time at a certain target area than you normally would by training in, for example, this is very common, doing a 5x5 with 5 minutes recovery in between. If you need 5 minutes recovery in between, it is because you've dug too deep. You've gone too anaerobic. You should not require that long in between sets. So what happens is, in order to maximize, the whole goal is to minimize this and maximize time spent at high intensities, so you can recruit all these muscle fibers, because remember, AMPK, we want AMPK levels to rise because they're going to increase mitochondrial content within your muscles. These guys already have a lot of mitochondria. These guys have less mitochondria, and these guys have even less mitochondria. So, but these guys like to make a lot of hydrogen ions. So, high intensity, keep it short to prevent these from accumulating and promoting fatigue, and do not dig deep. If you do that, you can raise the AMPK levels in all of these muscle fibers. You can increase the mitochondrial density in all of these muscle fibers, and you can actually start changing some of these muscle fibers into more type 1, which are the slow twitch but more fatigue resistant muscle fibers. Okay, so that is what I like to call the whys of aerobic FTP training, about why we can alter those things based on feeling. Don't dig deep, keep the intervals short, and maximize your time near VO2 max. So with that being said, let me go ahead and answer some questions. All right, so all right, anybody have any questions for me? questions so far? Okay. Should I just talk or type? Talk or type? Talk. Let's see. If I don't race, but just want to be all-around recreational cyclist training year-round, what mix of intervals week to week would you recommend? So, there's something called sweet spot training or sweet spot intensity. And sweet spot intensity, the reason why it's called sweet spot is you get the maximum bang for the buck. So the amount of fatigue that is accrued is lower for the amount of fitness being gained. Now this sweet spot area occurs around 90% of your FTP or around 85% of a 20-minute all-out test. So I would spend, if I want to keep really good fitness year-round, I would do these intervals regularly, maybe 2, maybe 3 times a week. You know, you're probably going to want to spend around at least 40 minutes in that exercise intensity, if not up to over an hour. And that should help you maintain a good, what I like to call a race-based fitness level. And then you want to intersperse, every once in a while, you want to intersperse some higher intensity efforts, which unfortunately they accumulate fatigue at a higher level, but are required for maximizing your performance. So do a lot of sweet spot training and intersperse occasionally some higher intensity VO2 max efforts, if not explosive efforts. But you don't want to get caught into doing too much of that, especially if you do a lot of riding, because then eventually that'll come back to bite you. Generally what I like to say is build a nice race base, and then 6 weeks prior to an event, that's when you start to really engage the higher intensity stuff. So yeah, but generally if you're doing low intensity stuff all the time, it's not going to get you too far, because slow twitch muscle fibers, which is the ones you'll be training, are already very fatigue resistant. You want to engage those type 2 muscle fibers and get those kind of changed around to where they become more aerobic powerhouses. All right, any other questions? This is just Shazi. Which type of power? Let's see. Shazi says, which type of power is easier to maintain? For example, a 20-minute threshold power effort or a 10-second power effort. I'm trying to divvy up my time to maximize both types of power thresholds. Well, 10 seconds really easy. So the thing that makes efforts like 20 minutes maximal efforts hard is hydrogen ion accumulation, and that happens when you start using an energy system that's called glycolysis. And during a 10-second effort, glycolysis is minimally engaged. It's mostly what's called the phosphocreatine system, so there'll be minimal amount of hydrogen ion accumulation during a 10-second power effort. So that would be easier. In other words, you'd feel less burning. But anything beyond a few minutes, really 3 minutes onward, maximal effort is really quite stressful, because you're going to have a lot of lactic acid. So yeah, I would do more 10-second power efforts if you're talking about trying to minimize fatigue, because a 20-minute maximal effort will definitely cause fatigue. Jason. Training for an Everesting, age 25. My maximum heart rate is 188, so much lower than 220 minus age. What intervals do you suggest, or mainly concentrate on zone 1, zone 2, and zone 3? Don't have a power meter, so using heart rate. So I like what's called polarized training. And I think it's more beneficial to spend time in zone 3 and zone 1 versus middling around in zone 2. And the reason being is because the adaptations that come from training in zone 3 are more robust in terms of increasing fitness and lactate threshold than zone 2. And zone 2 produces a little bit more fatigue than zone 1. So maximize your time in zone 3 and supplement it in terms of more endurance work in zone 1. That's what I like to do, polarized training versus spending in zone 2. I think you will find a bigger benefit in terms of power by doing that. And you don't have a power meter, so using heart rate. So you can go out and do a 20-minute effort, and your heart rate is going to be a little bit higher than your lactate threshold. So when doing a sweet spot intervals or zone 3, you want to back that down by at least 15 beats per minute from what your average 20-minute heart rate would be. But yeah, since you're not 220 minus age, definitely use your particular heart rate for designing those levels. So, any other questions? You're welcome, GT Hack. One other thing, Chazi, with regards to increasing your power. So if you're limited on time, for example, you can't do an hour-long threshold session, then what I would do is I do more Tabata intervals, shorter sessions with Tabata intervals. For example, 40-second efforts at your VO2 max separated by 20-second recovery sessions. You might want to do, let's say, 3 blocks of 8 of those. And you should be able to get that done in less than an hour. But ideally, you want to set aside at least 2 days a week where you can do longer threshold power efforts and less super high intensity stuff, unless you're very close to a race, in which case you're going to lower the volume and increase the intensity. But generally, that's only within the last 6 weeks prior to an event. Right? Any other questions? Chazi, so you say, what do you think of the 80-20 effort right now? For every session, I tend to dedicate 80% of my time in zone 2-3 and 20% in the high zone. So 80-20 is common, but it really depends on how much time you have. If you have 20 hours of training if you have the ability to train 20 hours a week, then 80-20 is great. But if you have, let's say, 6 hours to train a week, you definitely don't want to divide that into 80% low intensity and 20% high intensity. Then you want to skew more towards higher intensity. And if it's really short, like 6 hours or less, then you want to start looking at doing VO2 max type intervals versus longer threshold sessions because you simply don't have time. And the other thing is, you say zone 2-3. I would focus more on omitting zone 2 and doing the bulk of my training in zone 1, provided you have time, and focusing on zone 3 as well. So I would do zone 3, focus on that, then supplement with zone 1, particularly at the end of your workout sessions, because that's when you're going to be burning a lot of fat. So we really don't start to utilize a lot of fat until the end, kind of when you get up to that 3-hour mark. So get the quality done first. So the you don't want to go out and ride for 5 hours and then do your intervals, because you're going to be carrying fatigue and therefore limit the quality of the session. Warm up, get the zone 3 done first, and then add on with the zone 1 endurance. And you can kind of transition up to about 60% VO2 max for that endurance work. And then that'll help you burn more fat during the session to try to, not only improve your watts, but also drop your kilos in terms of fat. All right, next question. Hi, thanks for your time. Why my 20-minute power going uphill is not the same as going on the flat, no matter how hard I try on the flat? Any advice? So, yeah, this is common in that when you're climbing, so think about your body position in terms of climbing. When your body position in climbing, you are more upright. You're more sitting upright. This facilitates more oxygen being delivered to your muscles, right? So you can think about how a lot of time trial people, when they get in that body position tuck, their power drops off. Mine drops off. But you're trying to balance out power and aerodynamics in that case. And in many cases, what I found out that by getting in an ideal aerodynamic position on my TT bike, I can sacrifice some watts and actually go faster. So on the road bike, on flat ground, typically your hips are a little bit more flexed than going uphill. And also some cadence has something to do with that as well. But generally it's body position. The more upright you sit, the more aerobic power you can develop because your cardiovascular system can deliver more oxygen to your tissues. So that's really the reason why. GT Hack, I follow training plans that have a steady week. I have a steady week every 4th week, but 6 to 7 hours a week doesn't feel like I need a steady week. Would you recommend an off week for time crunch cyclists? So this all depends on how much overload. So for example, if you were training once a week, the recovery time relative to your training time would be so vast that you would be completely recovered after if you're training 1 hour a week. So you would not need to incorporate a recovery week for that type of a training schedule, really low volume. At 6 hours a week, provided that you intersperse some recovery days at 6 hours a week, if you did 1 hour every day, then you would have 1 recovery day. In that case, if they were all high intensity sessions, you might want to incorporate a couple other recovery days. So it depends on how you get them together. If you did a 6 hour day and then you did 6 days off, obviously, in a 6 hour training week, you would be recovered by the end of that. So lower volume, you do not necessarily have to take recovery weeks off. But that being said, I want to leave you with this. When you take 48 hours off, so 2 days, your VO2 max will not drop. Your fitness will not drop. So with that in mind, knowing that your fitness will not drop after 2 days off, all right, don't be shy about taking a couple of days off here and there, all right? So a lot of people get all freaked out that they're going to lose a lot of fitness if they take 1 day off or 2 days off. Take 2 days off, you're not going to lose anything. So even if you're at really low volume, don't be afraid to listen to your body and say, oh, maybe I need a couple of days off, maybe not only physically, but mentally. And don't worry, you're not going to lose a thing. Sometimes it pays to be a little bit conservative. All right. Jason, I have 10 to 13 hours per week to train with a max of 16 hours per week. Recommend 80-20 or 6 hour scenario as previously mentioned. So this, Jason, this really boils down to you. So for example, if you were a world tour professional and you were forced to do 16 hours of training a week, I would skew more towards doing higher intensity and therefore reducing that ratio of 80 to 20 because you are more adapted to that much training load. So if you did more higher intensity, it's not going to cause you to overtrain. However, if you're used to doing, let's say, 6 hours of training and you go right into doing 16 hours per week, then you're going to want to be more conservative and adhere more to the 80-20 ratio. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Let's see, any other questions? But I want you guys, this is the recruitment order effect is I want you guys to really pay attention to that, all right? That if you're going to cruise around, you're going to get some cardiovascular benefit, but not nearly as much cardiovascular benefit as doing 75% or higher. But more crucially, you're not going to be training the type 2 muscle fibers. And I will tell you that the most adaptable or changeable muscle fibers are type 2 muscle fibers. Type 1s and really type 2Xs, they're not as moldable, but the type 2As are very moldable. In other words, the type of exercise that you do is going to change your type 2As into becoming more specific to that type of exercise. So if you do a lot of endurance work, type 2As are going to become more endurance. They're going to become more like type 1s. If you do a lot of sprinting work only, the type 2As are going to become more like type 2Xs and less like type 1s. So type 1s are very moldable, very responsive to training. So you want to make sure that you're training those by training at least above 40% VO2 max when you're not doing recovery work. Okay, what else? Some of the symptoms from overtraining. So some of the symptoms from overtraining are such as mental staleness, just like you do not want to train, not motivated to train. You have problems with sleeping. You might have problems with eating. You might actually overeat. You may not be hungry. But what I like to really look at is number one, resting heart rate. So if you're overtraining, your sympathetic nervous system is usually out of whack. That's the fight or flight nervous system. And when your sympathetic nervous system becomes more dominant, your heart rates tend to rise. All right, so that's one thing I look for, elevated resting heart rate. I look for whether you're mentally enthusiastic about training. That starts to wane. Another thing I think you need to look at is you need to look about how your muscles feel. This is very important because we are not robots. We're not computers, so we can't perfectly predict how you're going to respond to training. One day you just might feel sore and you have no real explanation for feeling sore. In that case, you probably want to listen to your body and take it easy, right? But again, I just want to keep in mind that if you take 2 days off here and there, you can resolve a lot of fatigue and you're not going to lose overall fitness. So keep that in mind. Taking 2 days off is not a big deal, and sometimes it'll help you bounce back if you're not feeling good, your muscles are sore, so on and so forth. What's a good way to train cadence with efforts around FTP? I usually like to grind at 70. Seriously struggle around 70 pounds. Seriously. So what I would suggest, Victor, is typically the optimal cadence increases with power. And that's because as power increases, we use more and more fast twitch muscle fibers, which are more efficient at higher cadences. So at 300 FTP, usually you're going to be in that 80 to 90 RPM range, maybe a little bit higher than 90. If you like to grind at 70, you might want to look at getting a bike fit because you shouldn't be bouncing around even at 90 RPM. That shouldn't be occurring. You should be fairly stable. So I would look at getting a bike fit, making sure that my my cranks and my seat height and all that are correct to keep you from bouncing. And I'm not a big, although I do prescribe training with cadence, I'm I'm not a big believer in setting specific cadence intervals. But generally, if you're going to do a TT effort, you're going to want to go a little bit higher on the cadence than you normally train with. So I would get a bike fit to make sure that I'm not bouncing, and then try it again. So yeah, it looks like it's a bike fit problem if you're bouncing. Any other questions? No worries. Thank you, Victor. Any other questions? Chazi says, some days I feel like my legs are burning, but if I push through the mental pain, then I may continue to produce good power. Yet other days when I feel this same leg burning, I can't push anymore. Yeah, so there is something to be said for mental toughness. And when I say mental toughness, sometimes it boils down to how bad you want it. So like for example, in certain events, maybe it's a state championship TT, maybe it's San Dimas stage race, I will definitely be able to push through the pain a little bit more just because I want it a little bit more. But in some cases when it's not a very important either training event or race event, you may not be as likely. And sometimes some things can throw you off mentally. For example, you might have a hard day at work, come home and you're just not really enthusiastic about killing yourself, right, so to speak, not literally. So yeah. Jason, regarding the Everesting challenge, looking at 16, 17 hours of climbing, recommend high torque, low cadence intervals to stimulate incline or rather higher cadence. Yeah, so race higher. I would race at a higher cadence. But I wouldn't do like so specificity, right? So you want to be very close to what you're actually racing at, what you're training at. But I would err on the higher side when I'm racing. So for example, if you're kind of in between where you're normally training at gears wise, I would go up one gear to keep a little bit higher cadence than normal. But again, specificity. So if you're always training lower cadence, it's not going to translate as well to race if you aren't also racing lower cadence. So what I would do is just be a little conservative and make sure I spin a little bit more and I'm not mashing the pedals during the race, but keep it pretty close. Why does my body behave like some days it can push and some days it can't? Well, it could be due to accumulated fatigue. And this is not something that is perfectly predictable. And we always think of fatigue in terms of peripheral fatigue or muscular fatigue, but we can also have mental fatigue or what's called central fatigue. So that's not something we can perfectly predict, and I usually tell people to listen to their bodies in that case. And keep in mind that even taking 2 days off, like I said before, 48 hours is not going to affect you long-term performance, and it might just be enough to allow you to recover and do better during your next training session. Those guns, Charles. Yeah, I started lifting again. So yeah, thanks for that. Any other questions? Any other questions before we call it a video session? Last question. I can always rely on Chazi to ask questions. All right, so why do tour guides like to ride even on day off? All right, so this has to do with, think about, for those of you who know what glycogen is what our muscles store carbohydrates for use during high intensity efforts. So when you go out and you ride a long training session, your muscles will deplete of their stored carbohydrate called glycogen. After you stop exercising and are in recovery mode, provided that you provide your body with carbohydrate, your body will replenish those glycogen stores and usually replenish those glycogen stores to a higher level than what you had before. This process is called supercompensation. Now, when glycogen is stored within your muscles, they increase their volume. All right, you can think of them as filling up with carbohydrate. Well, if you're constantly depleting your glycogen stores day after day, racing for 100 miles, when you all of a sudden take a day off, you can expect your muscles to basically swell up with glycogen. This swelling up can interfere with metabolism the next day afterwards. So the reason why World Tour cyclists like to actually ride on their rest days and eat lower carbohydrate, you may have seen that too, is to keep their glycogen stores from overfilling and causing essentially the swelling of their muscle tissue and decreased performance the next day. So that's really the reason. So hopefully that answers your question. Yeah, so, and look at riding an hour and a half at relatively easy pace to a World Tour pro who's riding 25, 30 hours a week during the preparation period is recovery. Bob, thanks for the thumbs up. Any other questions? All right, then we're going to call it. And yeah, until the next lecture, thank you guys for coming. Have a great day.